See, we do this. It's unscripted. We're just going raw. Welcome to the Convocation Unscripted, a podcast at the intersection of religion, culture, and politics. I'm your host for this episode, Dr. Jemar Tisby, and I'm joined by my esteemed colleagues, Diana Butler Bass and Kristin Du Mez. Robbie couldn't join us. He is taking a very well-earned vacation. Well, if you haven't listened before, you need a reminder the way it works. Someone introduces a topic, no one else really knows what that's going to be, and we give you our authentic, honest responses in the moment. That's why it's called the Convocation Unscripted. And this episode of the Convocation is now in session. So I just want to start by naming the fact that our lives take place beyond the religion, culture, and politics stuff that we're about to talk about. So this week, it was an eventful week for me. I was at Essence Fest, which is like the biggest celebration of Black culture down in New Orleans, happens every year. That was an amazing, if ridiculously muggy and hot time. And at the front of it, it was storming and raining, and we had to drive through roads where the water was almost as high as the bottom of the doors. And then I chased the storm to Houston, where we had our podcast recording retreat just in time for Hurricane Beryl. And so all of the electricity was spotty and in and out, trees falling over, not as bad as they've sometimes gotten, but it was still a thing. We couldn't my other podcast, Pass the Mic, the co-host couldn't join us. His travel was completely canceled, and we didn't have internet at the Airbnb where we were staying. So how
Oh,
on earth do you record, upload, all that stuff? All of that to say, because we didn't have this technology that I've become so dependent on, I feel like I missed a ton of news this week. But the one bit of news I did get was in Oklahoma, they just had a policy, a meeting to decide that their social studies curriculum, which is where you get most of your history, it is going to be overhauled by a committee that includes Dennis Prager, David Barton, Steve Deace, and Kevin Roberts. Did y'all hear about this?
yeah. Several people sent me texts, tweets, or emails about this. And my first response, my most honest, unscripted response was my heart sank because these people are relentless. They have no credentials as historians. They don't know what they're talking about. They're literally propagandists when it comes to history. And I just keep going back and thinking about this book that was very influential in my life when I was first in graduate school. It was a little paperback book that was written by George Marsden, Mark Knoll, and Nathan Hatch. And it was called The Search for a Christian America.
Mm.
And literally, those three historians, all three of whom I got to know as a young scholar, they dismantled David Barton. I mean, literally, after I read that book, I thought David Barton has got to go hide under some rock somewhere
Mm.
and never show his face again for shame, because he has been taken apart by three of the most prestigious religious historians in America. It wasn't secular people who were taking him apart. And yet, no, he's prospered. He's made millions and millions and millions of dollars, deceiving whole congregations of rather naive churchgoers with his thesis about America as a Christian nation. And all of what they have done, I don't know the others. I mean, I know Prager's work, and I mean, he's not an academic at all.
Makes stuff up.
He's not, yeah.
He just makes stuff up, right?
Yeah.
That's the thing. They just make stuff up.
Yeah, he just makes stuff up. And he's, kind of paid to put these ideas in the public square. So anyway, these guys are awful. The idea that the moral historical imaginations of a generation of young people in any state in the union would be shaped by them is so appalling that I can barely breathe. So that's my unscripted response.
Yeah, it is a gut punch, isn't it? Because, I wrote about this just a little bit on Substack this week, but this isn't just a kind of conservative framework for history. This isn't just a conservative spin even on American history. It is pure fabrication.
Mm.
When you look at, so this is propaganda. It's propaganda, and now it's always been there. No, it's always been very, very popular in conservative evangelical spaces, disturbingly so. And you're right to bring up that book, Search for Christian America. I love that book. I actually assign portions of it sometimes when I teach US history today with my students as a kind of primary source. This is where the conversation was at in the early 1980s when they wrote it. But also, it's devastating that it is still as relevant today, which normally you think, oh, that's a great thing if you write a book and it's still relevant today. But it's actually a big fail on the part of Hatch, Marston, and Knoll, because that book didn't, which was devastating to the whole, pseudo Christian history enterprise in terms of, just shredding it factually. It did not make a dent in the industry. Not at all. I mean, the industry was in its infancy back then, really, if you go back and look at it. So it's really frustrating for historians to even have this even in our conversations, which we've had for decades, right? I remember in graduate school too. We bring up David Barton, you get a big eye roll, like, oh, that guy, right? I just don't think they were taking him seriously enough. He was just this kind of annoying pest, but what can you do, kind of thing. You wrote the book, you move on. Um, and now I mean, for a long time, it's been shaping Christian school curriculum and very much homeschool curriculum, right? So millions of American children have already been getting this pseudo history, and now it's they're going after the quote unquote government schools. And I want to just point folks to Warren Throckmorton's work
Yes.
on this. And Warren Throckmorton has been really just steadily going toe to toe with Barton, right? No eye rolls here, nothing sarcastic, just devastating facts. He wrote Jefferson's Lies, or Telling the Truth About Jefferson's Lies. I can't remember all the Jefferson drama. And Warren Throckmorton has this really excellent podcast out. Now, if you Google Jefferson's Lies, you'll find it. Jemar, you were on that podcast. Fabulous work on that. But that podcast will just walk you through, if you're wondering, do I believe these folks here on the convocation, or do we believe, this new Oklahoma curriculum? Who's telling the truth? Listen to that podcast, and just minute by minute, you're going to see evidence presented, evidence weighed, and you're going to see over and over again how Barton and his cronies are just consistently and repeatedly lie.
It's interesting, and I can't wait to hear a little bit more about this. But I often talk to groups about the nature of history, and I'll say, history consists of many things, but there's sort of two major portions of it. One are a set of facts that, really are kind of indisputable. Things like there was a big war in the United States between 1861 and 1865. There was a thing called the Declaration of Independence written in 1776. The first people who were enslaved landed on American shores in 1619. Those are all things that happen. We have dates attached to them. We have documents and all that kind of stuff. And that is part of history. And the other part is interpretation, is how do you interpret that data? And that part is always changing. But just because interpretations change over time, it doesn't mean that history is a matter of opinion. And that's that to me, it seems like that's sort of the essential thing they are trying to do here, is create this sort of mask of doubt around history, saying, oh, what those people in the convocation believe, that's just what a bunch of secular liberals look. It's two women and a black guy. Who's going to believe them? That's just their woke opinions. Aren't you going to trust us? The guys in suits who have Prager University and millions of listeners and all this kind of stuff. Our opinions are more worthwhile. And history just doesn't function that way. way. And so I want to really, I would love to hear you two, who are such great colleagues, talk about that.
You said it. Oh, I love the way you put it. And so history kind of, this is an analogy I recently thought of. I used to be a sixth grade teacher and a middle school principal, and I always got the sense that everybody thinks they can teach because everybody's been to school or everybody knows something, right? So they think they can teach, yeah, whatever. But there's an entire academic discipline where you get degrees in how to teach. There's masters and PhDs. There's an entire pedagogical field about pedagogy, but we think we can do it because it's so common, right? I kind of think people think of history that way too, that I can do history, I can express history, I can quote unquote know history because I can do a Google search or because I learned this fact or this data, as you put it, Diana. But then there is an entire field of a historical discipline that has standards, that has practices, that has checks and balances, particularly in the form of peer review, right? And it's not the same. Just because you've learned some data about history or you've read something that has history in it, there's a lot you got to sift through in order to understand the interpretation and what that author or speaker is talking about. So I think it's this fine line for me of wanting folks to understand there are actual standards to this discipline. And you can't just go out there and unearth something that happened in the past and call it history in a sense that's going to be super helpful. At the same time, I don't want it to be something that people are so intimidated by that they think they can't access it. They can't understand it and come to their own conclusions. So I find a tension there. But as we've used in this conversation, the folks we're talking about, the Dennis Pragers, the David Barton, Steve Deace, Kevin Roberts, this is propaganda. In the design, you got to know their angle.
That's right.
Their angle is, like you said, the thesis is to devise this mythology of a Christian nation, right? And also, I think part of their design is to create this narrative of constant progress past all of is particularly around slavery, right? They want to say, oh yeah, slavery happened, it was bad. It wasn't as bad as they say, but we moved past it and now we're better. And those are the narratives that you don't have to go into all the minutia. You don't have to refute them point by point. But if you want to know where they're coming from, they're trying to argue that the United States was a distinctly, uniquely Christian nation. And to the extent that we adhere to their fundamentalist conservative interpretation of Christianity, America prospers. And to the extent we don't, we die as a nation. And the other part is this narrative that things kind of just inevitably get better over time. And it didn't take sacrifice and wars and arguing and constant struggle to bring about the rights that even now are very precarious.
Yeah, I think too, I'll add that, this isn't just kind of elite professional historians who are
Snobbery.
jealous about their book sales, right? uh, and we're not actually talking even about amateur history here. We're talking about pseudo history, right? This
Yeah.
isn't just, not skilled at the interpretive context, but trying to be fair with the facts on the ground. Absolutely not. Somebody like David Barton is creating facts, right?
Mm.
He is making stuff up out of whole cloth, and he's been called on it over and over and over again. And sometimes he will like silently drop things without ever saying, my bad. I mean, that's not how history works. If you make a mistake, you are held accountable and you've got to fix it, right? And then people aren't going to trust you as much, and rightly so, right? But no. Like,
Wasn't he sued at some point?
yes, yes, and
That's what I
his
thought.
book was taken from by a Christian publisher, Thomas Nelson. They took his book out of circulation, out
That's
of
right.
publication. Right. So this is indisputable that he just is incredibly unreliable and intentionally so.
Mm.
But here's the thing. even after his lies were exposed over and over again, he is still promoted on websites like Focus of the Family and evangelical organizations across the Christian right. And he has been absolutely formative in the education of people like Mike Johnson. Right. Mike
Mm,
Johnson, you want to understand Mike Johnson's views on democracy, or excuse me, our republic. You want to see Mike Johnson's views on, Christian America and who real Americans are, right? Read David Barton. No, it's a bunch of lies. And this is what we're dealing with right now in this country. And this is sadly what Oklahoma school kids are going to be dealing with as well.
I'm pretty sure that Barton had a sort of a congressional reading group
Yes. No, he did.
under the
oh,
Trump administration.
yeah.
Yes.
And the last time that Republicans were in charge of Congress.
Goodness
Yep.
gracious.
Yep.
And just a word about Dennis Prager. He is, I'm so glad you used that term, Kristin, pseudo history, right? He's a pseudo historian. He's a pseudo scholar. But what he's done is create an entire online educational ecosystem to
Of pseudo scholarship.
promulgate his pseudo scholarship. He'll get the
Yeah.
furthest right wing whatever. No credentials necessary, no vetting necessary, except that you have this right ideology, right? And will put on a very high quality video, short, reel, whatever it is. So the unfortunate reality is the propagandists are really good at communicating really bad ideas. And so you can go to PragerU and get access to every subject you can think about when it comes to history, politics, some theology, all of it. And it's packaged in such a way that in this digital age, this information age, it can easily be spread, easily be shared, and all of that. And so that infrastructure, I think, is also part of it, right? So there's the book publishing as well, but there's this digital infrastructure, this communication structure that helps to promote these ideas in a really pernicious way. I've got so much to say around this, or so much to ask, really, because I came into this sort of sideways. Like I wasn't exposed to all of this as a Christian being formed. It was when I got to seminary that I first heard the term government schools. And I start
Mhm.
hearing this conversation about Caesar's school and giving your children to Caesar in education. So can y'all talk a little bit about this general attack on public education that seems to be picking up steam around the country?
Yeah, that whole language developed around sort of the most remote, in some ways, original corners of Christian Reconstruction,
Mm.
where I'm not sure if it was Gary North or Greg Bonson or one of the very early guys who were Rushduni disciples, who came up with this idea of calling all of public education government schools. And it was a way of trying to show that the government had infringed on one of the appropriate spheres of the family, and that education really belonged to this other sphere of influence, that is the family or the church. Kind of they go back and forth about who has that real authority. But it's certainly the government doesn't. And so that this incredibly subtle and kind of almost subversive rebranding makes, every time someone uses that phrase, it actually makes a theological point about this very conservative, I don't even want to say conservative, it's a radical theonomist Calvinism. And they want you to think that these are government schools instead of what they are. And that is locally operated, county by county, city by city, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, schools that are funded by cooperatives of taxpayers, in one of what was truly America's great ideas about making sure that the entire populace got a decent rudimentary education that would create decent citizens. And so a great American idea has been twisted by this movement into this this image of abuse and control and everything that it is not intended to be.
Let me add to that because you're exactly right, Diana. I mean, when I hear that phrase government schools, right, go back to Christian Reconstructionism, Rushdoony, and there's a long history there. Interestingly, I saw a reporter maybe a few months ago making this point exactly about the phrase government schools. And I saw a pile on then from other people like, oh, you don't, come on, you're being paranoid here. It's just another word for, public education. It's like, no, 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 no. Right. If you know, you know. And there's this long history here. But let me add that back in the day, so in the 70s and in the 80s, when this movement was really gaining some hold across conservative evangelicalism, and then it kind of grew from there. For most people, the idea when you heard that kind of rhetoric was, okay, so you pull your kids out. You therefore are going to homeschool or start your Christian schools. I mean, I was just giving an interview on Doug Wilson yesterday, and a great example here. And he's shaped by the same Christian Reconstructionist theology. He had that same rhetoric, and so when his firstborn was a toddler, he and his wife look around and say, we're not putting her in a government school. So they start their own school in Moscow, Idaho, and then they start New St. Andrews University, and then they start this whole homeschool organization, association, and curriculum, and right. So you pull your kids out. What's different now, and in the last few years, and very much in light of I think the power that Trump has brought to this strand of the right wing. Now the goal is, hey, actually, we can take over the government schools, right? It's this second revolution. To get back to Kevin Roberts, if we want to go there next, the second revolution, we can take over the country, take back the country. And that's what we're seeing in Oklahoma now. It's not take your kids and homeschool them or put them in a Christian school. It's we're taking over the country. We're taking over the schools. So I alluded to Kevin Roberts there, right? And he you guys, Diana, you were also on vacation not that long ago. There's a lot happening right now out there. It's hard
Yes,
to
there
keep
is.
up. But we have that rather chilling phrase that he used in terms of it was response. What was it in direct response to? Anybody want to take this up, or I can quick look it up? I think it was the immunity case, quite possibly. Let's see.
I know I missed this.
Okay. We need to get this here. We are in the process. Yes, this was responding to the SCOTUS decision on presidential immunity. And he came on, he reassured the right, we are winning now, right? We are winning. So this is the kind of a new landscape. And he sent a chilling warning to everybody else. We are in the process of the Second American Revolution, which will remain bloodless if the left allows it to be.
Oh, that's where that comes from. I heard that little phrase, but I didn't know what the context was.
Right. And
if the
of course,
left allows it to be.
If they allow it to be. So, behave. And this brings us, I think, to Project 2025, where, Roberts has his hands all over that. And what's interesting is, it's been around for a while, but it's suddenly really kind of getting the attention I think it deserves. And, a lot of folks are talking about it and paying attention now.
Finally.
I haven't read it yet. Have you?
Gosh, it's over 900 pages.
Yeah, it's over 900. I skimmed the actual document. I homed in on a few areas that I was particularly interested in. It's as bad and worse, as they say. I want to shout out to Raju P. Henson for talking about it at the BET Awards and on stage and bringing this into the conversation. More and more high-profile folks are talking about it now, which is great. It's late in the game. We've been talking about this for months and months and months now, but at least it's before the election. So yeah, what's really galling is they do feel like they're on the ascendancy. To your point, Kristin, they don't just want to, pull their kids or their people out of these institutions. They want to take them over. And Project 2025 is their comprehensive plan to do so. So we've often talked about January 6th as a dress rehearsal for the takeover, right? It doesn't have to be that spectacular in terms of a spectacle. It can be what is contained in Project 2025. You fire certain people and hire other people. You give the president immense power in the executive position so they don't have to pass it through Congress. They don't have to get approval. They don't have oversight. You've already installed a majority on the Supreme Court and even around the country in certain areas so that you can get the laws and the rulings that you need to make this happen. And really what's happening is this far right authoritarian takeover is already in progress. They just need somebody in the highest office to bust open both doors and let this thing out for real.
Exactly. And I think that to give a little
You
bit of an
guys are
overview.
giving me a real headache today, I got to tell you.
It was not a good
There is
week.
better
It was not a
news.
good week.
Yeah, I know.
Right. And I think that there's this divide out there right now that I'm sensing between people who are paying attention and then the
Mhm,
rest of the country and the
mhm.
rest of the Democratic Party or the rest of the anybody who's not in the totally, pro-Trump camp. That as somebody who is paying really close attention, I feel like it's, I'm questioning my sanity sometimes because people who I know, care about these things in a general sense, are not tuned in to know what's actually happening. And Jamar, you gave a really good description there because this isn't just about issues. And there's more than 900 pages. They talk about every possible department and issue, and right there's a plan for everything, and it is a lot to read. But some of the most disturbing things are exactly what you talked about, this essentially dismantling government as we know it, dismantling the civil service, which we've had for what, 1.5 centuries now, of just having qualified, nonpartisan folks who are essentially running the country, right? Not making the decisions, but carrying them out.
Right.
And that's the key plan here, is to purge the federal government
Mhm.
of anybody who is not a Trump loyalist. And they have vetting and they have training. That's part of this whole project. You can go online and check it out and you can try to get approved to be on that list. When they kick everybody else out who's not a yes man, if Trump wins the next time, right, they're going to stock the entire government, all the agencies, with loyalists. And really critical here, essentially take over the Department of Justice, right? Not have an independent Department of Justice anymore, but have the Department of Justice doing Trump's bidding. And if you listen to Trump's speeches, you know what that is. It's to go after his political enemies. He's very open about this, right? Very open about this. Now, this past week, as the Project 2025 was finally getting some traction in terms of, like, scholars have been talking about it a long time, a small number of journalists, but now it's getting some national attention. So Trump comes out on Truth Social and says, I don't even know who came up with this.
We
Right.
know
Of course,
nothing.
I mean, it's pretty much his entire staff of the last administration and all the folks who are expected, and right, folks who were writing the Republican platform that also came out this past week, right? It's the same people. So he knows very well who's writing that. And, sure, maybe not every single one of those points on the 900 pages
You don't
are
think he
going to
sat
be
down
pushed
and
through.
read line by line the
Gosh,
Project 24?
those are his people. That is his team.
Yeah.
That's right.
I mean, one of my questions is why would Trump try to distance himself from this?
To get
Is
elected.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, like, if do does the campaign see an association with Project 2025 as a detriment when it comes to voting, and then is there a potential to use that against him as to prevent this authoritarian takeover?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that the Democrats know that. Um, these things are, it kind of goes back to our previous conversation. When you used to talk about stuff like this, someone would call you an alarmist, or, oh, nobody really believes that, or that's all in your imagination, or what have you. But for them to have actually put it down in a 900-page document from the Heritage Foundation, I mean, we're not talking about we're not talking about PragerU here. I mean, this is one of the oldest, most deep-pocketed, influential conservative organizations in all of Washington, D.C. that's had, basically a hand in pretty much every policy apparatus of every Republican administration since it was founded. And so this is they've changed a lot in recent years, but nevertheless, the history of respectability is attached to them.
Mm.
And so this is a respectable group with a serious document that has footnotes. And I haven't read it yet. I was just talking to Julie Ingersoll, who's a sociology of religion person at University of North Florida, who writes about this stuff. And she says it's actually kind of dull in places where you just boring policies, sort
Well,
of
they
laid out.
outsourced, right? Different chapters, different sections, right? And it's
Yeah.
not just the Heritage Foundation, right? I mean, it is that they're the kind of key,
They're the umbrella.
organizers, the umbrella. There's more than 100 conservative
Mhm.
organizations that have signed on and have contributed to this. So, right, this is Trump's base. It's Trump's base, and this is the policy that they come up with. So, in terms of your question, Jemar, like why would Trump distance himself from this? He he wants to win, right? And so he'll take whatever works for him. And just like we saw on the issue of IVF, just like we saw very recently on abortion, right? Well, he's testing the winds here. And oh, is that a little unpopular? I've never heard of it, right? Oh, we can change that. Pro-life, like no, let's drop that because that's costing me votes in some of these.
I don't
key
want a
states.
national abortion ban.
Totally,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
I just
Right,
want to
and
do away with
so-
the 14th Amendment.
But the conservatives know full well that this is absolutely the agenda that is going to be on his desk day one. And so you're right, he has nothing to lose on that side. And he's just trying to muddy the waters in terms of critics and ordinary Americans who are rightfully alarmed.
So I think this is really helpful for folks to sort of wrap their minds around what's happening. Number one, we should know by now, Trump is an opportunist. I mean, whatever works, he'll do it. If it's not working in terms of popularity, getting him reelected, making him look good, he's going to throw it away because he doesn't have that sort of moral, ethical compass. All his compass only points directly back to him. And so whatever is going to help him, right? So we should know this. The other part is we're always getting the question, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? I think the more specific issues that we talk about, the easier it is to talk about what do we do. So with the first topic we were talking about, the social studies standards, right? We need to sound the alarm about this pseudo history. Make sure that your homeschool co-op is not using David Barton or even Dennis Prager materials because they have kids-focused materials in their expansive digital footprint, right? Making sure that you're writing to publishers and whatnot. So we were able to get that God Bless America Bible out of the HarperCollins umbrella simply as authors saying, hey, no, we cannot promote this conflation of God and country. So that does work on very specific issues and very specific causes. And then to this with Project 2025, if Trump sees it as a threat to his reelection, we should probably take that and run with it and let folks know, hey, this is the plan to enshrine minority rule, which I'm not sure a whole bunch of people are familiar with that term, but it fundamentally goes against democracy, where it's supposed to be we the people, and it's supposed to be the voice of the majority that carries policy, wins elections, things of that nature. So what I'm trying to tell folks is this is not just about November 24. It's not just about 2024 to 2028. It's about all of the ways they're going to use these legitimate levers of democracy to get into office and then switch everything up so that they'll never get out of office, no matter who's in the president seat.
Won't make a difference.
It won't make a difference. And we can't just wait until the next election to fix it, because it will already have been so transmogrified that we won't be able to use our voting power. We won't even really be able to protest, because that will be punished as well. And we're going to be living under a very different regime than we ever thought could exist in the United States. But it's right there mapped out.
I wonder if the experience of the Supreme Court right now, what many Americans are finally noticing about the Supreme Court, helps to underscore what you just said, Jemar, because you know, I think that a lot of folks just didn't pay attention to the Supreme Court. They felt like, justices were, above politics, that they were fair, that they really cared about justice, that, on and on and on, and that there have been innumerable decisions over our lifetimes that broaden the sphere of justice, that broaden the sphere of citizenship, that deepen the sort of roots of rights extended to more and more citizens. And so I think that people just sort of said, oh yeah, that's fine. We don't have to think about that. We don't have to vote on that. And yet there were many people, myself included, who in recent election cycles were saying, hey, the Supreme Court's getting kind of dicey, and a few more of these kinds of administrations, and we're going to have a Supreme Court that isn't committed to those same things. And lo and behold, what's happened is that essentially in 2 years, this Supreme, they came in at first, they were pretty modest. I think Roberts was trying to keep them under control. They didn't want to scare anybody, blah, blah, blah. And then just, in this last 18 months, they've let it rip and made us fully aware that we now have a 6-3 Supreme Court, and they are committed to reversing an enormous number of things that regular people have come to depend on in this country. That includes everything from the regulatory processes that kept our water and air clean to sort of being trampled to death by corporate profits and the ability of corporations to do whatever they darn well please in order to make money. The limitation of voting rights is where they started. Of course, white people not noticing that until, it was like, oh, they won't go any further. And then they kept cutting all that back. And then, of course, the big attack on women's, what I think is women's ethical freedom. And so they have transformed it generationally. I will probably, being 65, 20 years, if I am lucky, there will be a Supreme Court that will be more balanced by the time I die. But the chances are, if the structures and systems remain as they are, many of these people are going to be on the Supreme Court when I go and see Jesus face to face. And I don't like thinking of that. I don't like the fact that this is the court that my daughter's going to have to deal with for most of her adult life. But that's what we got. We have generational change in 18 months that was planned for 40 years in advance of that. And so that begins to show that there's a big old pattern here, that there are deep interests, religious, financial, political, all the different things that have come to the table to make sure that there's a government that works just for a few and benefits only the powerful. And they've been working on these projects for a long time in different guises through different avenues. And now they've sort of coalesced, and the power grab is here completely and utterly. And I think the Project 2025 is just another dimension of what we're seeing in the courts. And, that's keeping me up at night. That was the thing, people are going, oh, Biden's too old to be president. In some ways, I didn't like what I saw, at that debate. But what I really didn't like is when I was flying home the day that Supreme Court case came out, where they had overturned presidential, that presidents have near total immunity for anything that they do. I was shocked. I was crying in the airport. I mean, that is a fundamental change to American society that we're going to be living with for decades to come, unless we figure out what to do about it.
Diana, I just want to add to what you were saying, or affirm what you were saying, because in the midst of, culture wars are so in our face. But you brought up a couple of things there in terms of Supreme Court decisions. We're talking about deregulationism and just giving more and more power into the hands of those who already have it, corporations, right? The very top. And as historians here, we know that that has been the agenda, perhaps we can even say the primary agenda of the Christian right from its inception.
That's correct.
If you study that history, you see this very tight collusion between powerful business interests and conservative preachers. By conservative, that's such a problematic word, isn't it? By
It is
right
now.
wing fundamentalists and evangelical preachers, right? And when you go back and you read the documents and you look at the meetings that they were having and the networks they were crafting, they are very, very explicit that religion is a wonderful tool to use to manipulate folks. A religion is a wonderful tool to promote free market capitalism, right? And that is, I mean, if you go back and you look at, and this applies to a lot of mainline folks, also mid-century, mainline Christians, and then the evangelicals really took it and ran with it. Right? I'm talking about like partnerships between folks like, Jerry Falwell and, all the Christian right preachers, D. James Kennedy and Moral Majority, all of that, and folks like Rich DeVos, right? And before that, like the Hunts, and funding this Christian right, where the pitch to people in the pews are the moral values. Meanwhile, what they're accomplishing is deregulationism and just unbridled free market capitalism. And when you look at those charts of income disparities, just astonishing. And that is the direct result of this collusion. And that's also what we're seeing today. Even when so much of the focus is on other issues, don't lose sight of that fundamental transition. And I don't know how you pull that back, right? How do you get that power back once they have it?
I want people who are listening to us to understand that everything you just said is well supported by some pretty incredible historians. I think of Kevin Kruse's wonderful book about the mid-century and the anti-labor elements that fed into like the Billy Graham Crusades. And then I also think about work that I did that was actually never published, because it was work I did right before I got my rear end kicked out of evangelicalism. And I was writing a paper on evangelicalism in Southern California in the 1920s. And that whole complex of evangelical culture that emerged on the West Coast, which became a very strong strand of the Reagan Revolution, that was basically sponsored by Standard Oil Corporation. And how Standard Oil was part of the funding of what becomes Biola University, and the funding also of the fundamentals, and that publication that sort of forwarded fundamentalist theology all across the country in the 19-teens, 1920s. And so this work, you're absolutely right. And it isn't just the sort of, your opinion, and it isn't just kind of some wacky theory that the three of us might have. This is stuff that our colleagues have been working on for a long time. We have read ourselves the documentation of these kinds of connections, and to various levels, one degree or another, have also written and taught about them in different professional circles. And so I think that that's really significant, just to underscore for people. We're not just blowing, sort of the wind here. We're literally talking about the aspect of history that's provable facts. We have the receipts. We can show you.
History has the receipts. I love that.
History does. It has the receipts.
There is so much that happened just recently. We didn't get to talk about the GOP finally releasing their platform. We didn't get to talk about something that I was kind of flabbergasted by, although not truly surprised, but the handshake between Al Mohler and Douglas Wilson. Just
Mm.
so much to say around that.
I saw that. That made me go, oh my gosh.
Yeah, I'll have more to say, I'm sure, but we all do.
Did I ever tell you guys I actually preached in Moscow, Idaho?
Oh my gosh, you got to tell us that story.
Oh, well, I got invited to preach in the Lutheran church there. And that's the Lutheran church in Moscow, Idaho is the one sort of anti-Christian nationalist holdout congregation in all of Moscow, Idaho. And of course, they invited me to come and preach. And I had no idea before I went there. I just thought, oh, I'm going to Idaho, and I've never preached in Idaho before. And before I went, one of my colleagues said, "You're going to Moscow, Idaho? Do you know what's in Moscow, Idaho?" And they started telling me, and that's when I started paying attention to Doug Wilson. But I've actually been there, and people took me to, where the university is. I happened to be there during election season when they had put up an entire slate of candidates from their church to take over the city council. And interestingly enough, there are secular people in Moscow, Idaho. The secular people, the few Roman Catholics, and the big Lutheran church all sort of forged this alliance against them and defeated that particular slate of candidates. But they, as you well know, they just continued. And I think that Doug Wilson's reputation nationally has done nothing but grow. And my understanding from people I know up there is that because of Wilson, more and more like-minded people have moved to their town, and that the people who were opposed to him are fewer and fewer in number. But there was a wonderful woman that I met at a dinner that was given in my honor when I was speaking there. I sat down at the table. She was one of the funders, and she looked at me and she said, "I was the chairman of the Republican Committee of Idaho for my entire career." And I'm going, "Oh Lord, why did they put me at this table?" And then she said, "These people are not Republicans. Dwight D. Eisenhower was a Republican." And then she started going on and on.
Republican. Whoa.
About how they were all pretenders and they were lunatics, and that she didn't want anything to do with them, and that she would vote for a Democratic corpse over voting for any one of those people associated with Doug Wilson. And so I love that woman. I hope she's strong and doing well up there in Moscow, Idaho.
Yeah, we need that same energy right now in 2024. Thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you all for tuning in for this episode of the Convocation Unscripted. On behalf of my co-hosts, thank you for joining us. Remember to subscribe to our bi-weekly newsletter. So we do this audio version, but you can also get some written material from us. Go to convocation.substack.com, convocation.substack.com, and our individual Substacks are in the show notes there. We'll see you at the next Convocation.